The old house stood at the edge of the woods, a relic from a time long past. Its weathered exterior was draped in tangled vines, windows thick with grime, and the air around it held a stillness that made it feel forgotten. For years, the locals whispered that something strange lingered there, something unseen but ever-present. Tonight, it would be the site of an elaborate Halloween prank. The plan had come together quickly. Jeremy, the ringleader of the group, had convinced the others that it would be hilarious to scare their quiet, timid friend, Lucas. The party had already been in full swing at Jeremy's house, but he suggested a little side adventure to up the excitement. A few spooky stories, a quick scare, and they'd all have a good laugh about it later. "Come on, Lucas," Jeremy had said, throwing an arm around him. "It's Halloween. Time to face your fears." The group, Jeremy, Sarah, Paul, Megan, and Lucas, had driven out in Sarah's car, winding down the narrow, overgrown road that led to the house. As they parked, the full moon cast eerie shadows across the empty yard, making the house seem even more foreboding. Inside, the house was cold, with walls that groaned softly under the weight of years. A thin layer of dust coated every surface, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they explored, setting up for the prank. Jeremy, ever the mastermind, had arranged for a couple of their friends, Ben and Jake, to show up later, wearing costumes to add to the scare. They'd sneak in through the back, lurking in the shadows before making their move. Lucas, unsuspecting and already on edge, followed the group, his eyes darting to every corner of the dimly lit room. Jeremy led them to the large living room, where candles flickered ominously on an old wooden table. They sat in a loose circle, their voices low, as Megan began telling ghost stories designed to make Lucas uncomfortable. "And they say," she whispered, leaning closer to Lucas, "that sometimes you can hear footsteps upstairs, though no one's been there in decades." Lucas shifted uneasily, casting a glance toward the darkened staircase in the corner of the room. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. They laughed and teased, but there was something unspoken in the air, a tension they couldn't quite place. The old house seemed to press in around them, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, creating a chorus of unsettling whispers. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. "Here we go," Jeremy muttered, nudging Paul. They all knew this was part of the plan. Ben and Jake must have finally arrived, ready to scare Lucas with their carefully orchestrated surprise. A creak from the floorboards echoed from the hallway outside the living room. Slowly, a shadow moved into view, a tall figure dressed in dark, flowing fabric, its face obscured by a mask. Lucas froze, his breath caught in his throat. Who is that?" Megan smiled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Relax, it's just..." Before she could finish, the figure stepped closer, silent, but its presence unmistakably chilling. Something was wrong. Jeremy, who had orchestrated the entire prank, frowned. This wasn't part of the plan. "All right, Ben, you've had your fun," Jeremy called out, his voice steady, though his eyes narrowed. The figure did not respond, standing still, its gaze fixed on them. Paul shifted nervously in his seat. "Ben?" No answer. The room grew colder, the shadows thickening. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though contemplating the group, before it began to move again, slowly, deliberately. "Jake?" Jeremy tried, his voice growing quieter. No reply. Just the sound of the figure's footsteps, each one louder, more oppressive. Sarah, who had been the calmest of them all, now stood up, her voice shaking. "Okay, that's enough. This isn't funny anymore." But the figure kept advancing, and as it drew closer, something unsettling became clear. It wasn't Ben or Jake. The mask, the costume, the air of menace, it was all wrong. And then the door to the living room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The sound of the door slamming reverberated through the room, bouncing off the cracked walls like the echo of a distant thunderclap. The group collectively flinched, startled by the sudden finality of it. For a moment, no one moved. The room was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint, irregular sound of breathing. The figure, now standing just a few feet from the circle, seemed even more imposing under the dim light of the flickering candles. Who locked the door?" Sarah whispered, her voice strained, as though any louder sound would invite something worse. Jeremy stood, trying to regain control of the situation, but the confidence that had fueled him all night had drained away, leaving him with the same mounting unease that gripped the others. "It's just a prank," he said, but his words lacked conviction. "One of you did it, right?" His gaze shifted from face to face, seeking reassurance, but found none. Megan's usual smirk had disappeared, her hands now gripping the edge of the table. Paul glanced nervously between the figure and the closed door, the joke clearly no longer amusing to him either. Lucas, pale and visibly trembling, stared wide-eyed at the figure, whose presence felt heavier with every passing second. The figure stood still, its head tilted as if listening, absorbing the fear that rippled through the room. The mask was a crude, hollow thing, pale and expressionless. But it wasn't just the mask that unnerved them, it was the absolute stillness, the unnatural calm that radiated from it, as though it had all the time in the world to wait, to watch. "We have to get out of here," Megan finally said, her voice trembling but resolute. She rose quickly, her movements frantic as she reached for the door handle. She pulled it, expecting resistance, but the door didn't even budge. It was as though something far stronger than any lock was keeping it shut. She yanked harder, panic rising in her chest, her knuckles white from the strain. "It won't open," she gasped, stepping back. Jeremy, feeling a rush of adrenaline, crossed the room to help, pulling at the door with all his strength. The handle rattled uselessly, but the door remained as unyielding as stone. "Stop messing around!" Jeremy shouted, but the frustration in his voice betrayed the fear that had begun to creep in. "Let us out!" But no one answered. The figure remained silent, unmoving. "What is this?" Paul whispered, backing away from the door and nearer to the table, his eyes darting between the others as if one of them might suddenly reveal this was all an elaborate trick. And then, slowly, the figure took a step forward. Its movement was deliberate, slow, as though it had all the time in the world. Each step seemed to draw the walls closer, shrinking the room with an unbearable tension. The group instinctively huddled closer together, as if proximity alone could protect them from whatever malevolent force had infiltrated their night. "All right, this isn't funny anymore." Sarah's voice cracked, the edge of hysteria beginning to show. "Take off the mask. Tell us who you are." But the figure gave no indication it had heard her. Instead, it continued its slow advance, its presence a dark blot in the dim light, filling the space with a thick, suffocating dread. Jeremy turned to the others, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Ben and Jake were supposed to meet us here, but that's not them." "What do you mean it's not them?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes never left the figure, as though looking away might invite it closer. "Who else would it be?" "I don't know." Jeremy's voice rose. "But Ben and Jake, they wouldn't do this." There was a pause, the kind that swells with the weight of realization. Something was wrong. Something beyond their control. This figure, this intruder, wasn't part of any plan they had made. "We need to get out of here," Paul muttered, inching towards one of the boarded-up windows. His hands fumbled at the edges of the old wood, trying to pry it loose, but it wouldn't budge. The boards had been there for years, perhaps decades, and seemed to have fused with the house itself. There's no way out. Jeremy looked around, panic flashing in his eyes. The old house, which had seemed like the perfect stage for a Halloween scare, was no longer a harmless playground for pranks. Now it felt like a trap, one they had willingly walked into. What do we do? Megan's voice was tight with fear, her usual bravado completely gone. The figure had stopped moving, now standing just beyond the reach of the candlelight, half shrouded in shadow. It tilted its head again, as if observing them with some hidden purpose. "We wait," Lucas said quietly, his voice trembling. "Whatever it is, it wants something." The candles flickered, and the shadows danced along the walls, as though the house itself had come alive, drawn to the tension, the growing fear that gripped them all. The figure remained still, an unsettling presence that filled the room with an unspoken threat. And in that suffocating silence, they realized something terrible. They were not alone, and whatever game they thought they were playing had already changed. The air in the room grew thick, pressing down on them like the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Each breath became heavier, each heartbeat louder in their ears. The candles flickered again, casting long, wavering shadows that danced erratically across the walls, as though mocking their growing unease. The figure remained still, almost blending into the shadows, but its presence was undeniable, looming, watching, waiting. Sarah's eyes darted toward the boarded windows, her mind racing. "There has to be another way out," she muttered under her breath, not truly speaking to anyone but herself. Desperation had already begun to creep into her voice. "A back door, maybe. A cellar." "We checked the house when we got here," Jeremy replied, his voice tight with frustration. "There's no way out but the front." "Then we break it down," Paul suggested, though his words sounded as hollow as the house around them. "It won't work," Megan muttered, her gaze fixed on the figure in the corner. It locked us in. Somehow." The group fell silent again. Megan's words, though spoken softly, carried the chilling weight of something more sinister, something they were all beginning to understand but refused to say out loud. It wasn't just a prank anymore. "Whoever you are," Jeremy called out, his voice breaking the fragile quiet, "you've made your point. This was funny at first, but now it's gone too far. We'll leave. We won't say anything, all right?" The figure stood motionless, giving no sign it had heard, much less understood. Its silence was impenetrable, and in it, Jeremy felt his confidence crumbling. "Maybe it can't hear us," Lucas whispered, his voice a thin thread of sound, barely audible over the anxious thrum of his own pulse. "Maybe it doesn't care." Megan turned sharply, her eyes wide. "What do you mean it doesn't care?" Lucas didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the figure, as if waiting for it to move, to give some sign, any sign, that there was still a human being beneath the mask. But it just stood there, casting its long shadow over the room, its stillness more terrifying than any sudden movement could have been. "Look," Jeremy said, his voice wavering between anger and fear, "I don't know who's behind this, but we're getting out. Now." He grabbed one of the old wooden chairs from the corner, dragging it toward the door with a sharp scrape that set their teeth on edge. "Help me break this thing down," he demanded, his eyes burning with the need to act, to do something. He slammed the chair against the door, once, twice, each blow reverberating through the room like the echo of a dull bell. But the door didn't give. It didn't even rattle in its frame. "It's no use," Paul said, his voice shaking. "It won't open." Megan shook her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. "Maybe it's waiting for something," she muttered. "Waiting for what?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But no one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, as the group's collective panic began to rise again. And then, slowly, something changed. The figure, which had stood perfectly still for what felt like hours, shifted. It took a step forward, and another. The sound of its footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed in the otherwise silent room. The group froze, watching in horror as the figure began to move toward the center of the room, where the circle of candles still flickered weakly. Each step felt like the ticking of a clock, a countdown to something they couldn't name but could feel, deep in their bones. "What does it want?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the figure as it stopped at the edge of the circle. Jeremy, his face pale, dropped a chair. "This isn't part of any prank," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "No one planned this." Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then who is it?" The figure stood at the edge of the candlelight, its mask catching the dim light in such a way that it almost seemed to smile, a grotesque, hollow expression that sent a chill through the room. And then, slowly, it raised its hand. A collective gasp filled the room. No one moved, no one spoke. They could only watch in frozen horror as the figure's hand lifted higher, pointing first at Jeremy, then at Sarah, then at Paul, Megan, and Lucas, its gesture slow and deliberate, as if it was counting them, marking them. "What is it doing?" Lucas whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. It's choosing," Sarah muttered, her voice thick with dread. "It's choosing one of us." Jeremy's eyes widened. Choosing for what? But no one knew. No one could guess the terrible game that was unfolding before them. The figure's hand lingered in the air for a moment, and then, with an eerie finality, it lowered itself to its side. The stillness that followed was suffocating, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. And then, without warning, the candles flickered out, plunging them into total darkness. For a moment, the darkness was absolute. It swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the sound of their own breathing, shallow, frantic gasps in the void. The last flicker of the candles had been so sudden, so sharp, that it felt like a physical blow. And then, without warning, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. Creaks, faint whispers in the walls, the shuffling of unseen feet. The darkness magnified every noise, turning each into something larger, more ominous than it was. "Someone, find a light." Jeremy's voice broke the spell, his tone sharp and panicked. "We need a light." There was fumbling in pockets, the sound of cell phones being pulled out, but one by one, they all realized the same horrifying truth: no one's phone was working. The screens remained black, dead in their hands. "This isn't possible," Megan whispered, her voice quivering. "My battery was full." "Mine too," Paul replied, though his voice carried no comfort. "It's like everything's been drained." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay in this house." But even as she said the words, the oppressive feeling of being trapped seemed to close in tighter around them. The darkness had weight. It pressed down on their shoulders, seeping into their skin, into their minds. And then, from somewhere in the blackness, there came the faintest sound of movement. A slow, deliberate footstep. "Who's there?" Jeremy demanded, his voice loud but shaking. His hand reached out in the darkness, grasping blindly for something, anything, that might give him a sense of direction, of control. The sound came again. Closer this time. The soft scrape of a shoe against the wooden floor, as though the figure from the corner had come to life once more. "Jeremy," Sarah's voice was barely audible, trembling. It's in the room with us." "I know," he muttered, Though what he could possibly do with that knowledge, none of them knew. Another footstep. Closer. Jeremy turned, trying to follow the sound, but in the pitch black, there was no way to tell where the figure was or where it was going. He felt trapped in a nightmare, each second dragging out as though time itself had been warped by the house. "Stay together," Megan whispered. "We can't let it separate us." But as she spoke, the sense of someone, or something, moving through the room intensified. The figure wasn't just standing still anymore. It was circling them, moving through the dark with slow, deliberate steps, a predator playing with its prey. "Do you hear it?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. They all heard it now. The soft, rhythmic pattern of the figure's movements, each step calculated, as though it were drawing nearer, waiting for the perfect moment. And then, in the silence between those steps, another sound, softer but unmistakable, emerged. It was the sound of breathing, not their own, but something heavier, more deliberate. It filled the room like a low wind, brushing past them in the dark. "Where is it?" Megan's voice cracked. "Where is it coming from?" But the breathing was everywhere. It surrounded them, growing louder, more oppressive. The group huddled closer, the walls of the room seeming to close in as their unseen tormentor moved ever nearer. "I'm going to the door," Jeremy whispered through clenched teeth. "If we stay here, it's going to..." Before he could finish, there was a loud crash, a chair being knocked over, or something heavy hitting the floor. The sudden noise sent a shock through the group, and they all flinched, instinctively moving back from where they thought the sound had come from. But in the darkness, there was no way to tell. "What was that?" Sarah gasped. "It's trying to scare us," Paul muttered, though his voice carried no real conviction. "We need to stick together," Megan urged again, though her words were met with silence. The truth was beginning to settle over them like a cold fog. They were not alone in this house, and whoever, or whatever, was with them had no intention of letting them leave. Another sound, this one softer, more deliberate. The scrape of metal against wood. The hairs on the back of Jeremy's neck stood on end. His pulse quickened. "What was that?" "I don't know," Lucas whispered back, his voice trembling. "But it's close. I can feel it." Suddenly, the faintest flicker of light broke through the darkness. It was so brief, so faint, that at first, they thought it was a trick of their minds. But then it appeared again, an orange glow, like the dying embers of a fire, coming from the far corner of the room. "The fireplace," Sarah whispered. "There's still some heat in it." Jeremy didn't wait. He lunged toward the dim glow, the others following close behind. The faint light offered little comfort, but it was enough to push back the darkness just a little, enough for them to see the outline of the room once more. But the figure was gone. "It's not here," Megan whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jeremy crouched by the fireplace, feeding bits of old wood into the remaining embers, trying desperately to coax a flame to life. The small fire began to grow, casting flickering shadows across the room once more. But the relief was short-lived. For as the firelight danced, their eyes were drawn to the walls. Etched into the wood, deep scratches marked the surface, symbols, words, twisted shapes that none of them recognized. They spiraled across the walls, covering every inch, as though the house itself had been inscribed with some forgotten language. What is this?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Sarah stepped closer, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the markings, but she stopped just short of them. "I don't know. But it's everywhere." "Who did this?" Jeremy asked, his voice hollow. "Who would go to all this trouble?" Paul shook his head. "No one did this. This was here before we even got here." And as they stood there, bathed in the weak light of the fire, they began to realize the truth. Whatever force had brought them to this house, it was far older and far more dangerous than any prank they had imagined. The fire, though weak and flickering, cast enough light to keep the darkness at bay, but only just. The etched symbols on the walls glowed faintly in its light, their meanings inscrutable, unsettling. As the group huddled closer to the fireplace, an overwhelming silence filled the room, a silence so thick that even their breathing seemed to fall beneath its weight. "Someone must have done this," Megan whispered, as if saying it out loud would force the idea into reality. "These symbols, they're just a prank. Right?" No one answered. Even Jeremy, who usually found comfort in rational explanations, was silent. The oppressive feeling in the house, the way the darkness seemed alive, breathing, it was beginning to fray the edges of their reason. "We should go," Sarah murmured, breaking the silence. "Forget about the door being locked. We need to find another way out." Paul, crouched by the fire, shook his head slowly. "It's not just the door, Sarah. This house, it's not letting us leave." The words hung in the air, thick with dread. No one wanted to believe it, but the truth of it gnawed at them all. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, with the house. "Maybe there's a window," Lucas said, his voice strained. "We can break a window and get out that way." "Yeah," Jeremy agreed quickly, latching onto the idea. "Let's find a window." They moved as a group, hesitant and cautious, the firelight shrinking behind them as they ventured deeper into the house. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet felt louder than it should have, echoing in the vast, silent rooms. The oppressive sense of being watched, of being followed, grew with each step. The first window they found was in a small room at the back of the house. Sarah pushed aside the heavy, dust-covered drapes, revealing a window sealed shut with thick boards. They hadn't noticed them before, but now, in the faint firelight, the boards were unmistakable, nailed in place with a force that suggested whoever had put them there had no intention of letting anyone in or out. "Who did this?" Megan asked, her voice cracking. "Why would someone seal the windows?" Jeremy ran his hands over the boards, testing them. They were old, brittle, but firm. "We'll have to find something to pry them off," he said, though even as he spoke, the hopelessness of it was sinking in. "We should keep looking," Paul urged, his voice shaking slightly. "There has to be a window that isn't sealed." But as they moved through the house, room after room revealed the same story: windows sealed, doors locked, every possible exit blocked. And all the while, the oppressive darkness pressed closer, as though the house itself were closing in around them. "Maybe there's something in the basement," Jeremy suggested, though the thought made his stomach turn. The basement, in a house like this, felt like the last place any of them should go. But what choice did they have? Reluctantly, they made their way toward the narrow staircase that led down into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder with each step, the faint smell of damp earth rising from below. The walls were close here, the space too narrow, too confined. It felt as though the house itself was funneling them down, deeper into its grasp. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the faint glow from the fireplace upstairs seemed impossibly far away. The basement was almost pitch black, the only light coming from the thin beam of Jeremy's phone, which flickered weakly in the darkness. "It smells awful down here," Lucas muttered, covering his nose with the sleeve of his shirt. "Just find something we can use," Jeremy said, his voice tight. He scanned the room with his phone, its light casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, broken chairs, and boxes stacked in haphazard piles. Sarah stepped forward, her foot catching on something soft. She let out a startled gasp and jumped back. "What was that?" Megan moved closer, her own phone flickering to life for a brief moment. The light revealed a pile of old, moth-eaten cloths, nothing more than remnants of what might have once been a carpet. Relief washed over them for a fleeting second. But then, from the far corner of the basement, came the unmistakable sound of movement. It was faint at first, a soft shuffling, like something being dragged across the floor. But it grew louder, more deliberate, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Whatever was making the noise was coming toward them. Jeremy. Megan's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. What is that? Jeremy's light flickered again, barely illuminating the far corner of the room. But there, in the shadows, something moved. At first, it was just a shape, an outline too large to be an animal, too unnatural to be human. It moved slowly, as though dragging itself toward them, and with each passing second, the air grew colder, heavier, until it was almost impossible to breathe. "Run!" Jeremy shouted, breaking the paralysis that had gripped them all. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. Lucas and Paul followed, scrambling up the narrow steps as fast as they could, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the top, they slammed the door shut behind them, the sound echoing through the house like a final, desperate plea. The basement door rattled in its frame, but whatever was down there made no attempt to follow. For a moment, they stood there, gasping for air, their backs pressed against the door as though holding it shut with their bodies could keep the house's secrets from spilling out. What was that?" Lucas stammered, his face pale. "I don't know," Jeremy replied, his voice hollow. "But it's real. This house, it's not a prank. It's not a game." They all knew it now. The figure that had been watching them wasn't just part of the prank. The house had its own plans for them, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The house, silent now except for the faint creaking of its old wooden beams, seemed to settle around them like a predator waiting for its prey to tire. The group sat huddled by the dying fire, its flames barely enough to cast their flickering shadows against the walls. No one spoke for a long time. The oppressive weight of the night's events was suffocating, and they were all too afraid to say what was on their minds. But it was Lucas who finally broke the silence, his voice low and trembling. "What do we do now?" Jeremy, still staring into the fire, shook his head slowly. "There's nothing we can do." "We can't stay here," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. "We have to find a way out. We have to." "And go where?" Paul muttered, his voice harsh. "The windows are boarded up. The doors are locked. We've checked everything. There's no way out." "We didn't check the attic," Megan said quietly, her voice barely audible. Maybe there's something up there. A window or a ladder. Something. The attic." They had avoided it, not wanting to venture further into the house's unknown spaces. But now, it seemed like their last hope. Jeremy stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each step required immense effort. "It's worth a try," he said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his lack of faith in the idea. "Let's go." They moved as one, a tight group, not daring to let the darkness swallow them again. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they climbed to the second floor, where a narrow, rickety staircase led up to the attic. Jeremy was the first to reach it, and as he pulled on the cord that released the ladder, it came down with a groan, dust billowing out in thick clouds. "After you," Paul said, his voice tense, but Jeremy shook his head. "We go together," Jeremy insisted, and with a deep breath, he led the way, climbing the shaky ladder into the pitch-black space above. The attic was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and stale. It was larger than they expected, the ceiling slanting down sharply on either side. Jeremy's phone flashlight swept across old trunks, forgotten furniture, and cobwebs thick in the corners. "Check for a window," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah moved toward the far end of the attic, her own light revealing what appeared to be a small window, but when she reached it, her hope dissolved. It was not just boarded up, the boards had been nailed from the outside, thick slabs of wood that were impossible to move. "No," she whispered, backing away from the window. "There's nothing." And then they heard it again, the soft shuffling sound. Only this time, it wasn't coming from behind them. It was coming from above. Megan looked up, her breath catching in her throat. "It's on the roof." The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was up there was searching for a way in. And then, as if in answer to their unspoken fear, something slammed against the roof, hard, the entire house shuddering with the impact. "We need to leave, now," Jeremy shouted, grabbing Megan's arm. But before they could move, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang. The noise echoed through the attic, bouncing off the walls, as the group froze in place. The only light now came from their phones, and even that felt inadequate against the darkness that was closing in around them. "It's here," Sarah whispered, though she didn't need to say it. They all felt it, the presence, the thing that had been watching them, waiting for this moment. They ran toward the ladder, but as they reached it, the attic filled with a low, rumbling sound. The house was groaning, as if alive, as if it had been waiting for this very moment to trap them completely. The ladder collapsed, and the attic door sealed itself shut, leaving them no way out. "There's no escape," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." The attic grew colder, the air thick with an otherworldly chill. The presence was no longer just outside, it was in the room with them now. They could feel it moving in the shadows, watching, waiting for the final act to unfold. Jeremy's light flickered, casting brief flashes of illumination across the room, and in those brief moments, they saw it, a figure standing in the corner. The same figure that had been watching them all night, the one they had thought was part of their prank. But this time, there was no mistaking its malevolent intent. The figure stepped forward, its mask glinting in the dim light, and with each step, the air grew heavier, colder, as though the very house itself was closing in around them. The figure's face was hidden behind the mask, but they could all feel its gaze, fixed and unrelenting. "What do you want?" Jeremy demanded, his voice breaking. The figure said nothing. It merely raised one gloved hand, pointing directly at them, as if marking them for whatever fate awaited. And then the house groaned once more, the walls seeming to close in, suffocating, inescapable. In the end, it wasn't the figure that claimed them. It was the house itself. The darkness, the cold, the endless sense of being watched, it all consumed them, one by one, until there was nothing left but silence. And when the morning came, the house stood as it always had, silent, forgotten, with no sign of the night's events. The police, called by worried parents when their children never returned home, found no trace of the group. The house, they said, was abandoned, empty. But those who had lived in the town for generations knew better. They had heard the stories. Stories about the house that lured people in and never let them leave. And as Halloween came and went, the house remained, waiting for the next group to come knocking, for the next act to unfold. It was, after all, just a game. A game the house had played many times before.